Hey everybody, welcome back to a new year here on Hail State Debate. It is officially the start of the 2019-2020 school year. It is September, it's fall. I guess it's not really fall. It's certainly not fall in Mississippi. It doesn't get to be fall down here until like November. But regardless, it is September, and that means it's time for us to take on the very first resolution of the year, the September-October topic, resolve the European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a whale of a topic. I have to apologize. It's just going to be me on this video. Josh McCoy, who I know a lot of you guys like, will be back next time for the November-December. He's not here for some logistical reasons. We also have a brand new team member, Mia Robertson, who's going to be great. She is a two-time elimination round participant at NSDA Nationals. I think made it to round 10 last year. She's going to be great. Have a lot of insight on PF. But you will have to make do with just me this time. And that is a little bit unfortunate because this is a whale of a topic. The European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. I feel like maybe the NSDA kind of bit off a little bit more than it can chew here. It might be just a little bit too much. I think we said this on Twitter that we felt like it was going to be too broad a topic to have sort of clear, easy to follow debates with good clash. There are just too many variables in my opinion, too much vagueness. And I will tell you that the more research that we've done getting ready for this video, the stronger those feelings have gotten. I mean, I've not gotten more optimistic about it. And I think the reason why it is potentially a difficult topic is that virtually every word in the resolution is potentially problematic, right? So if you just go through it quickly, look at the Belt and Road Initiative. As we're going to see later in the video, it really doesn't have a clear, concrete definition. It has no legal status. It's not a treaty. It's not an international body like the UN. It doesn't have a single governing agency. It's really just kind of a name that we give to this large set of different projects that China's involved in terms of financing these infrastructure deals. And now beyond that, China's already saying that they're going to make some changes to how it works, so we don't even know what, if any, changes there will be to the structure of it, to the extent it even has a structure, right? There are no real rules except whatever terms of whatever deal you strike. So, for example, if you agree to a contract with China to build a dam or build a port, yes, there are rules in that particular contract, but beyond that, there are no real clear guiding principles. So it's really hard to talk meaningfully in general terms about what the benefits and the harms of Belt and Road are, because there really are no sort of generic rules or principles about what it has to be. It's also very difficult to know what it means to, quote, join Belt and Road Initiative. There is no formal membership like NATO or NAFTA. A lot of countries have signed these memoranda of understandings, but as we'll see later, these are just agreements to sit down and try to negotiate a specific financing deal, right? So, one thing the pro might say is, well, hey, joining just means we agree to sit down and negotiate with China. There's no downside to that, so there's no reason not to vote pro. And then lastly, there's the term European Union. This is fairly straightforward, but as we'll see later, it's not even clear that the European Union actually has the legitimate authority to join Belt and Road to the extent that involves actually negotiating building infrastructure projects. It's not at all clear that that's one of the powers that the European Union as an entity has. So, in other words, there are just some issues in the world that may not make good resolutions for an event with 4 and 2 minute speeches, and I think this is one of them. But we don't get to whine about the hand that fate has dealt us. We have to soldier on. So what we're going to have to do is try to find some strategic points that teams can try to control in this big, massive, global, sprawling debate to simplify the debate for the judge, to make it clear, to have some things that are not dependent on the different directions the debate can go in, that you can kind of consolidate your advantage on. And also maybe to try to take advantage of some of the problematic nature of some of these terms and use some of the vagueness to your advantage. We're going to look at a lot of different angles on both sides, so we are going to have to go fast because there is just a lot to cover here. There's a lot of research to do. This is going to be a topic on which, it's going to take putting in time. It's going to take putting in hours to be prepared for a lot of different angles. As always, we want it to be useful to you, so if it is, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe consider telling a friend. Remember, we are on Twitter with insights about the topic, the occasional additional article or source, thoughts about new resolution voting and that sort of stuff. We are at Hail State Debate. And lastly, if you are brand new to the channel, just to give you a quick overview, we are a channel that is about kind of melding real world analysis with kind of debate world analysis. In other words, there's a lot of sources out there that kind of talk about the way we debate in kind of debate world with the jargon and the techniques and things like that. We know how to do that, and we know know that it's important, but we also want to give that an overlay of arguments that can also hold up in the real world. So arguments that can appeal to both a community judge, an expert in the field, and an expert in debate, a really experienced debate coach. So that's the idea. We think it's an effective way to debate. We think it's a fun way to debate. So hopefully it will be useful to you. And so the outline for the video will be, we will start with definitions and framework, basically defining the terms and offering some general ideas about how to frame it. Then we'll move on to the pro, then to the con, and then finally we will wrap up. So let's move on to definitions and framework right now. Okay, let's get started on some definitions, and I will tell you right off the bat, this is going to be complicated and it's going to be a bit of a slog, but that is what we get when we have a topic that takes, on the one hand, a super amorphous international thing like Belt and Road that we're not quite sure what it is, but it has a lot of tendrils reaching out into the world, and we try to mesh it with a massively complicated supernatural treaty organization like the EU, and then when we use a word like join, which surprisingly may be the most complex definition of all, because it's not a real good fit for like what the EU might actually do. So we have a not a great phrasing of the resolution, and we're gonna have to parse out like exactly what's happening when you sign your ballot, judge. Like what are you mandating to have happen? Because it can get awfully confusing, and depending on the interpretation, it can get really difficult for either side. So let's start off with Belt and Road Initiative, which ironically and surprisingly may be, as complex as it is, it may be the simplest definition that we have to talk about. So the Belt and Road Initiative, as envisioned, is a massive infrastructure financing project sponsored by China that spans now over 68 countries and has an announced investment as high as $8 trillion. That's probably more of an aspirational goal. We're not anywhere in that neighborhood. And the idea is to finance the construction of transportation, energy, and telecommunications projects linking Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, really anywhere that China can find a willing partner to basically make the world's transportation and energy infrastructure much more linked and dependent on China. Now, it was formally adopted in 2017 by China's National Party Congress, but in reality, it was unveiled back in 2013 by President Xi Jinping. And we know that China is an autocracy, and so any sort of illusion of voting on things is just that, an illusion. And it was approved formally in 2017, but that was just a formality. This has been the policy of China since at least 2013. It has two main prongs, as you probably know if you've done any reading on it, which is the so-called Silk Road Economic Belt, which is primarily referring to the land-based infrastructure, road, rail, transportation of that nature, and then the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which is the port-based water aquatic transportation. Kind of ironic that the part that is ocean-based, that is on the seas, is referred to as the road, but then Chinese is a complex language, or set of languages actually, so we'll forgive that. There are multiple corridors spanning everywhere from the Arctic to the Southern Hemisphere. Hundreds of billions of dollars have already been invested in projects under it. Morgan Stanley, the investment company, predicts that $1.2 to $1.3 trillion will actually be spent by 2027. So we're not at the $8 trillion total, but still an awful lot of money. Right. Now, one thing you might be asking after I just give you that sort of spiel that you've probably read in articles, you may still be frustrated and wondering, okay, Brett, but like, what is it? Like, what in terms of action verbs is it? Is it a treaty organization? Is it a multinational club of some kind, like the UN? Like, what is it in very practical terms? And I'm glad you asked, because the truth is, as we're going to talk about in just a minute, China has been deliberately vague about what it is. One thing we know for sure, it's not any kind of formal legal organization that has formal binding legal rules to join it. There is no Belt and Road Club that is legally, a legally existing entity under international law. There are some agencies that may be arguably kind of regulated in China, but not really. But there's no UN, there's no NATO, there's no independent legal organization. There's also no formal treaty. Right? There are individual memoranda that may or may not be binding that individual countries sign, but there are no formal treaties. In fact, a European Parliament white paper on the Belt and Road from January 2018 just flat out says there is no universally accepted definition of exactly what the Belt and Road is. So that may be an issue that we have to take on its own, because if you don't know exactly what something is and you really don't know what the obligations are, that might be one reason in and of itself to be skeptical about joining it, whatever the term join means, right? But the short answer, the kind of quick and dirty answer, if you just want a practical one for the debate round, is it's basically a loan program. It's a financing program by which state-owned entities in China, like these massive state-owned banks, right? The government goes out and sort of pairs them up with infrastructure projects, and they take their billions of dollars, in capital that are floating around, and they agree to finance infrastructure projects, whether they are in usually transportation, but also in energy, also in telecommunications. And in exchange, what you get as the host country is you get very favorable financing in comparison to what you might get in other places. You get, at least on its face, what looks like a good deal with a good interest rate. It might a better deal than you might otherwise to be able to get, particularly if you're a small country like a Sri Lanka or a Malaysia, or if you're a dictator or something that wants to build some trophy airport for yourself, and no real investor would want to do it because they know it's not going to be viable economically. Well, China might well do it, right? In that sense, they're kind of like a loan shark that swoops in and gives you a deal on something that other people might not do, right? In exchange for that, what China's going to get is a couple of things. First of all, you're probably going to have to agree that Chinese firms are going to do the work, right? So China's going to be able to send labor and capital from its country over to its companies are going to come over and build this thing, which is obviously going to help the Chinese economy, right? And then in addition to that, it may have other terms that it imposes on you, right? You might get terms such as China may be able to come in and seize control of it if you don't make payments. There are going to be examples of that, right? You may have to pay in ways other than, financially. You may have to transfer, oil or natural resources to them. They're going to get their cut of whatever they want out of it, right? So, but as we said earlier, to be clear, it is a set of individual deals. Each one of these financing deals is its own individual deal, right? A country might enter into a memorandum of understanding to negotiate with China under the Belt and Road Initiative, right? But that doesn't require it to do anything. Each one of these financing deals, each one of these projects is its own thing. So it's not an organization like the UN or NATO or NAFTA. It's just a name. The Belt and Road is really just a name for a whole bunch of individual projects under a sort of general theme by China, right? So that makes it a little bit more complex. Now you might ask, what is it for? Like, why is China doing it? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, China saw a massive boom in its economy after its transition to a modified capitalist model in the late 70s and early 80s, saw tremendous construction all over the country, building highways and rail lines and building whole cities out of nothing, right, throughout the country. But that's slowing down over the last few years. And so what the Xi Jinping and what his administration want to do is they want to deploy those resources, that labor and that capital, in other places all around the world to build infrastructure in other places, because the demand and the need in China is starting to dry up. So in one sense, it is the ability to kind of go and deploy your excess capital around the world to keep the economic growth going, to avoid a recession, to avoid things falling off, because the Chinese regime is very, very dependent on continued economic growth. In many ways, the basic deal that the Chinese Communist Party has made with its people is, we will continue to provide you with a better economic standard of living than you had, and in exchange for that, you will let us be an authoritarian, totalitarian state and do things like having social credit scores and to monitor you and to sort of limit human rights. So it's very, very critical for China to keep that growth going, because it's sort of part of the basic thing that holds the structure of society together, more so than even for other countries. That's one part of it, but the even bigger part of it is that the Belt and Road is about soft power. And soft power, if you don't know, is just a term that means a country's ability to influence other countries through anything other than like war, right? So when we talk about soft power, it might be too soft a term here, because China is very much playing hardball when it comes to Belt and Road. They're not using the military, but everything else at their disposal in terms of trying to influence the global economy, they're being very aggressive with it. How do you get soft power and influence? Well, there's several ways. If countries are dependent on you for financing their infrastructure, if they owe you debts, right? Well, they're much less likely to criticize you. This is a point I've made in previous videos. If you owe somebody a debt, you're much less likely to criticize them. In some cases, China will end up with ownership or equity stakes in the project itself. They may end up owning all or part of, or controlling all or part of, say, a port or another like depot on their infrastructure network. Well, obviously, if you control a major port or another piece of infrastructure in a country, it's much more difficult for that country to oppose you on things like the South China Sea, on things like human rights, on things like your treatment of like Uyghur Muslims in China, who, a million of whom are basically imprisoned in these sort of like prison cities that that they've effectively built, right? And then lastly, if you build all the infrastructure, then all of the infrastructure is going to point back to you. All roads lead to China, and you're just going to build stronger economic ties with these countries. They're going to be just generally more dependent on you for trade, and the more dependent they are on you for trade, the closer relationship they have with you. So make no mistake, this is absolutely a very transparent effort by China to supplant the United States as the major hub for the global economy. That's clearly what it is. And in many cases, state-run media doesn't even try to deny that, right? In some ways, you could compare it to sort of a modern-day version of the Marshall Plan, which is what the United States did to rebuild Europe in the wake of World War II. China probably has somewhat different goals here, but to be fair, the United States doing the Marshall Plan wasn't completely magnanimous. We did it to have more influence in Europe, and it worked, right? And China, I think, looks at that and sees that the more economic infrastructure you help build, over the long run, the more influence you have. And certainly that is a big, big part of their goal. So that is a far too brief rundown on this blob of amorphous deals called the Belt and Road Initiative. Next, what is the European Union? Well, we all know what the European Union is. It's a supranational, not supernatural. I don't know if we'll find a funny graphic for that, I'm sure, but it is a supranational organization of European states that began as simply a common economic market, but today is a true multinational government in some areas. It oversees certain things like competition policy, like trade, like free movement of people within the European Union. Obviously, Brexit is going to presumably have it down one member very soon, but we know what it is. The question is, what does it mean in the context of this particular resolution? In other words, what actually has to happen for the European Union to join the Belt and Road Initiative? And there are really two options. One of them is pretty plausible and the other's not. So the non-plausible one would be to say that the European Union joins when individual states join. I don't think that's right. The other option is the European Union means that the European Union as an entity has to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, there are several reasons why I think that's the more logical interpretation. First of all, the actual language of the resolution. The resolution uses the definite article "the," and then it uses European Union. It does not say EU member states. It does not say the states that comprise the European Union. It doesn't say European countries. It says the European Union. It's a proper noun, and that refers to the organization. It has its own legal status. It has its own parliament. It has its own executive. So that strongly implies that this organization has to be the actor, not just the members. If we say the United States federal government should do X, then, if a bunch of individual citizens do X, most people would say that that's different. Even if a bunch of states do X, that's probably different. That's clearly different as well. The federal government is the federal government. The European Union is the European Union, right? But in addition to that, in many cases, we tend to think that in debate, the pro or the AF has to advocate a change in the status quo. And the only way you could advocate a change in the status quo here is for the European Union as a bloc, as an entity to act, because over half the countries in the EU already have signed some kind of memorandum of understanding with China on the BRI. So multiple members of the European Union already have made a move to join. As a matter of fact, there's already a framework that's called the 16+1 format, which is a framework by which many of these more Eastern European countries are already negotiating with China for these specific deals under the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's already this framework that's going on, as this European Parliament committee report notes. However, there is some ambivalence within the European Union, as the South China Morning Post notes. In 2018, 27 out of 28 ambassadors with a meeting with Beijing voted to condemn the Belt and Road as an economic initiative, saying that it's unfair and it's trying to sort of distort and divide the European Union. But ultimately, I think that the clear, reasonable interpretation is that the European Union as an entity has to enter. And as we're going to see in just a few minutes, that creates some potentially problematic issues for interpretation. But before we get there, there's one important question to ask, which is, if you vote for the European Union to join Belt and Road, what does that mean in terms of the individual countries? I think obviously you can vote as a judge and say that your fiat power means that you can join, that the entire organization joins. But remember that currently France and Germany have voiced strong opposition to joining the Belt and Road Initiative, and they comprise almost 40% of the GDP of the entire European Union. So if you vote for the European Union to join, does that mean you sort of magically... I've had some people say they think that this would resolve disputes within the European Union, and I don't think that's right. I don't think when the judge votes for the EU to join that just magically makes their dissent go away. I don't think if you vote to ban assault weapons in the United States in a debate round, that magically makes everybody agree that banning assault weapons is right, like the half the country that would disagree with that. And I don't think here that if you vote to have the EU join, that means that France and Germany lose their opposition. I think what you have if you vote to join is you have a situation where you have to accept the status quo, which is that 40% of your GDP thinks this is a bad idea, which means you're going to be further fracturing a union that has already been fractured by the departure of Britain through Brexit, right? And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that if it is in fact the European Union that you have control over as the actor on your ballot, as the judge, then that's the only thing you can control, which is that actual governmental unit, not what the individual states think and what their leaders, and certainly not what their people believe, right? Okay, so that's European Union, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, amazingly, the most complicated term in the entire resolution is seemingly the simplest, which is join. And let me explain what I mean by this. Join, as a dictionary definition, is just to associate oneself with or to become a member of a group or organization. And you would think this would be straightforward, but not really. So ask yourself, like, what do you actually do when you join Belt and Road? Like, you know what you do when you join Girl Scouts or Cub Scouts? You go sign an oath, you take a pledge, you start going to meetings. Okay, fair enough. Do you actually sign a treaty? Do you enter into a contract? Do you join a formal organization like the UN or NATO? And as China and trade scholar Heng Wang in 2019 notes in his piece, China's Approach to the Belt and Road Initiative, the answer is you do none of those things. As he says, China adopts a non-treaty based approach to the BRI. There is no BRI-wide treaty or similar international law instrument establishing the BRI. The BRI neither has a constituting treaty with all BRI states, as is the case with international organizations, nor formal membership protocols. Moreover, it does not have many formal international law instruments, unlike most mega-regional agreements. In other words, there's really no legal status to this thing. And as Heng Wang explains, this is a deliberate choice on the part of China. They want to avoid being nailed down to any particular arrangement or any requirement on this. They really want this to be a case-by-case, deal-by-deal thing. Now, don't get me wrong, right? You do absolutely, as a practical matter, the most normal way that countries would probably in common parlance be thought of as joining the BRI is they sign these memoranda of understanding. But what do these memoranda of understanding say? Do they undertake any specific legal obligations? Do they say, we guarantee we will build X number of freeways and X number of ports? No. What they all say, I don't think with any exceptions that I'm aware of, is we just agree to sit down with you, China, and to try to come to some agreement to do these specific projects. We'll make a good faith effort to negotiate with you. That's what joining means, right? To join, the most realistic interpretation of joining, because there's no formal definition of joining. So you cannot look to anything like a process to join the Security Council or join the UN. There's nothing like that. So the next option is like, what is the most natural interpretation? And the most natural interpretation is countries sign these memoranda, but the memoranda don't bind you to do any of the infrastructure projects. They simply bind you to sit down with China and try to come up with a favorable deal, but you're still free to walk away. You don't have any legal duty to do anything you don't want. Well, this is a huge potential boon for the pro, right? Because what the pro can now say is, look, joining just means you sign an agreement to try to find infrastructure deals that will be mutually beneficial. If they don't work out, you can walk away from the table or you can try to renegotiate them. This is not only an offensive point in the sense that you sort of say it's all upside, right, and no downside. It's also a defensive point, right? Because anytime the con comes in and says, hey, look at all these bad projects in Malaysia and Sri Lanka and Ecuador. Look how bad they are. Look how lousy Belt and Road has been. Your answer can always be, fine, we just won't make deals like that. All we're agreeing to do is sit down. These countries are smart. The European Union is smart. We can look at these deals and make sure we get good terms, that China's not going to take these things over. We can make those deals, and if they don't like it, we'll just walk away. The only thing that can happen is upside. We either come to a deal that both sides like, or we just say, okay, thanks, we're not interested in any deals. If you have other ideas, come back and talk to us later, right? So that is an interpretation of join that is extremely, almost unfairly favorable to the pro. But there are also interpretations of join that are extremely unfavorable, favorable to the con. And that comes from the critical question that we have to ask, which is, can the EU even join the Belt and Road Initiative in any meaningful sense? Right? So if joining the Belt and Road Initiative means we are going to sit down and try to sign deals that build infrastructure projects in X country, right? Can the EU do that on behalf of its member states. Remember, we were going to say, I think, you may disagree, but if the member states themselves are non-topical because number one, they're already doing it, and number two, it doesn't say the member states, right? Well, then the EU has to do it. The problem is the EU doesn't have the power to do that, right? The EU gets its power from the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. This is the founding document when they went from being the sort of European community to being the European Union, right? And in Article 3B of the Maastricht Treaty, it basically says that you have these areas of what we call exclusive competence. These are the areas where only the EU can regulate. These are things like competition policy, trade within the European Union, and a handful of other things. I assure you that one of them is not building freeways or building train lines or building ports. That's not one of these exclusive areas that only the EU can do. Well, then if you look at Article 3B, it basically says if it's not one of these areas of exclusive competence, the EU shall take action only if the objectives of the proposed action cannot be sufficiently achieved by the member states. In other words, the founding document of the EU says you can only do things that are not in these core areas if it's something that the individual states on their own could not do. Well, clearly, EU states can join the Belt and Road Initiative, and we know that because they already have joined the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So, as a matter of fact, in February 2019, the EU adopted legislation in which member states have to report on foreign direct investment. And this was partly in response to Belt and Road. Foreign direct investment, obviously, Belt and Road is a form of that. You're investing foreign money into a country, into their infrastructure. But at the end of the regulation, one of the things they said is that ultimately the decision whether to do or allow the foreign direct investment, yes, you have to let us know about it, but ultimately the responsibility for deciding whether to do it or not remains with the member state. And the reason they did that was because they knew that as a European Union, as a supranational government, they didn't have the power to tell countries to build or not to build highways, or to build or not to build ports. They've never claimed that power. In many ways, the European Union's a lot more like the old Articles of Confederation that the United States had before it was the United States, right? It's a loose confederation where the central government has a few specific powers, but it cannot regulate everything that the member states do, right? In many ways, it's like that. And I would contend that there is a strong argument that the European Union simply does not have the ability to decide whether a freeway should be built through the middle of a sovereign country like Germany or France, or a port should be built in a city in a sovereign country, or even worse, not that just should be built, but they should be built by a third party, that is to say by China. And so one argument I think that the con can make is that in order for the European Union to do what the Belt and Road Initiative is, which is sitting down and trying to negotiate these projects, it would basically have to be making decisions about the building of infrastructure inside sovereign countries. Nobody thinks it can do that. For it to do that, like to fiat that from the judge, to have the judge's ballot just make that happen, you'd have to it would be a fundamental restructuring of what the European Union even is. And if you think countries are heading for the exits now with Brexit, if the European Union goes along and says, yeah, by the way, we have the power to tell you where to build freeways and ports. And by the way, we're going to have Chinese folks do it, Chinese, firms do it, right? I think you'd see a huge backlash. Even countries that were okay with Belt and Road in principle, I think would balk at the idea of having a multinational organization do it, right? So that is another massive problem when it comes to the term join. So I hope you can see that we weren't kidding when we said we thought this resolution was not worded great. But those are the ambiguities we have to deal with. We're going to look both at sort of a more traditional way of approaching the AF and the neg, but also with these frankly complicating definitional issues and some strategic positions you can take on them in the argument section. But I think you need to be aware that, hopefully you'll find yourself playing it straight and your opponent playing it straight, or maybe you'll try to be a little more strategic, but you need to be aware that they're out there. So with that, we will move on and we will begin with an overview of the arguments for the pro. Okay, let's get started with the pro. And before you say anything, yes, it is daytime now. These videos take a while to shoot, particularly on a complex topic like this. But what I want to do is start with a couple of preliminary kind of framing considerations for the pro, then move on to kind of what I consider the core arguments about like economics and why there's really no downside, and then kind of move on and look at some of the second tier arguments and kind of do some assessment of those. So let's talk about the preliminary considerations for the pro. The first one is whose benefits matter, and the second one is what are we going to do about the fact that arguably EU does not have the ability to meaningfully join Belt and Road. How do we get around that issue? So the first one is you got to ask yourself whose benefits matter in this debate. And what I mean by this is if the EU is the actor, in real life, we know that the EU is going to look overwhelmingly at its own member countries' benefits, right? That's what governments do. The EU is a supranational government. But in debate, the question we're asked, especially in this resolution, is what it should do, not at what it likely will do. So there is an argument to be had about whether the economic benefits to other countries, like, for example, to China, or to other third-party countries, like the other countries on the Belt and Road, whether those are fair ground for the pro. And note that this is important because most of the other countries that we're talking about, including China, are countries that have lower per capita income and, for the most part, lower standards of living than European Union countries. So one argument could come from sort of a distributive justice or humanitarian perspective that, whatever the EU probably will do, and it probably almost certainly will look after its own interests, what it should do, on a moral level might be to consider the interests of these countries. And so maybe arguments about benefits to the rest of the world would be fair game, right? That comes from sort of the general idea, the general perspective that, look, all human beings are equal, right? We have equal moral worth, and therefore we should all be considered in determining what an actor should do, even if they probably won't, right? The other argument, though, is that the EU is a government, and it is simply an agent of the countries and the people in those countries that comprise it, right? So, and as an agent, this theory would go, the only legitimate actions it can take are for the benefits of the bodies and the people that comprise it. So, the idea being the United States government can only act in the interest of the United States citizens or residents. I think both positions are potentially defensible, but I think you need to, particularly on the pro, really on both sides though, think about where you come down on that. Like, do you believe that benefits outside the European Union are relevant or germane to the pro case? If so, be able to articulate why. If not, be able to articulate why that's the case, right? The second framing issue is to be able to get around this idea that the EU arguably can't join BRI. We talked about earlier about how the European Union only has the ability to act when its member states can't do something, and the member states clearly can join Belt and Road. So what exactly is Belt and Road going to be doing here anyway? Because the European Union really, as just a common sense matter, probably isn't going to be approving building freeways and stuff through its member countries. And I think one way to get around that is simply to say, look, is to sort of embrace the vagueness and to sort of say to the judge, look, it is totally unrealistic for us in this very short debate to try to figure out the precise mechanism that the European Union will use, like exactly what kind of document it will sign. I think we can be pretty confident that all these smart diplomats and lawyers will come up with some way for it to sort of embrace the Belt and Road if that's what they want to do. They'll come up with something. We don't have to show you exactly what it will be. We don't have to show you that the EU will start actually like helping China pour concrete or anything like that. We just have to show you that as a general rule, the countries in the EU would be better off as having the entire bloc be a part of Belt and Road, whatever that means, however it's done, whatever the logistics are, that they would be better off with Belt and Road as opposed to without. In other words, it's not fair to ask us to, like, legally, how can EU do this? We're sure they'll figure out how to do it. It's just a question of whether they will be better off. I think that's not a bad way to get around sort of the odd fit of asking this government entity to join something that it may not have the power to join. So I might take a sort of broader approach like that with the pro and just say, look, the question is the EU better off? Not exactly how will they do it, right? And so with that, sort of turning to the major argument I think pretty much everybody's going to have to at least consider on the pro, probably going to be the core of a lot of cases, is economic benefits. And obviously, anytime you do infrastructure projects, the core idea is to move goods and services more efficiently, to facilitate trade, to grow the economies of all parties concerned, right? And so a lot of core pro arguments, and maybe even some entire cases, I think are going to center on overall economic growth. And there's sort of, here again, like two different tiers of it. One is like growth for the entire world, and then there's growth growth, specifically within the European Union. So looking to overall global benefits, the World Bank in June 2019 had this to say. It says, BRI transport projects can expand trade, increase foreign investment, reduce poverty. And the numbers that it gave are increasing trade by numbers between 1.7 and 6.2% for the world, and increasing global real income by 0.7 to 2.9%. Now, when we're talking about the income of the entire world, we're talking about huge amounts of money. And I'm a big believer of converting sort of abstract statistics into concrete statistics when you can, so that your judge can find them memorable, especially if it's a more lay or community judge, not a trained sort of PF judge, right? And so when we look at these percentages, which are kind of low on their own, maybe compare them to the World Bank's estimate that global GDP is about $84 trillion. And if you multiply 0.7 or 2.9% by those numbers, what we see is that we could be expecting to have anywhere from $588 billion to $2.4 trillion a year added to the global economy if we complete all the projects envisioned in Belt and Road. And that's an astonishing number. It represents almost something like adding a fairly significant, like, new developed country to the world's economy every single year. So that's a pretty massive benefit, right? And you can frame it in terms of increasing and improving quality of life for millions and millions of people, right? So that's important. Now, on a more specific level to the EU, obviously there are going to be plenty of statistics and analyses you can look at. I don't think we need to go through each and every one in a lot of depth in the video. We'll try to link to as many as we can. But Bruegel, I think that's how you pronounce it. It could be Bruegel, I don't know, but it looks like Bruegel. Bruegel is a Belgian economic think tank, and from what I can tell, they seem to be pretty well respected in Europe. And their 2016 estimate, and it is from 2016, so it's a little bit dated, but what they say is that if we expand BRI, European countries, EU countries could see major net gains from trade that would come at the expense of Asian countries. So basically the idea is, if we expand the route into Europe of these major routes for trade, that's going to make Europe able to get its goods and services, mainly its goods, to China more easily, to buy Chinese goods more easily. That's going to expand our ability as Europeans to sell our products to China. It's going to create new jobs, create new trade here, and it's going to come at the expense of these countries who are already on the Belt and Road, countries that are maybe in some cases closer to China. They're going to lose out, and we're going to gain some of their market share. So the estimate that Bruegel has is Belgium will see a 9.4% increase in trade, Germany 8.4%. The EU overall will see a 6% increase in trade, and the losers in this will be countries like, for example, Japan and Morocco, places that may already be more closely connected to China, because the European Union will be coming in and competing for their market share. And what this might do is reduce the trade deficit that the European Union has with China and its countries have with China, which is good, although I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about trade deficits specifically, because trade deficits, we could spend a lot of time on this, are not necessarily the worst thing in the world. For example, I have a huge trade deficit with Chick-fil-A because I buy a lot more sandwiches from Chick-fil-A than Chick-fil-A buys from me. But that's okay, because Chick-fil-A sells chicken sandwiches. So a trade deficit in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing if all parties are getting what they want. But as you can see from these statistics that we've cited, it would be a tremendous growth to trade. And so there's that overall economic growth argument. And then a related argument is just improvements to infrastructure, potentially improvements to energy throughout the European Union. And you can go pick your favorite sort of proposed project, whatever's out there in the literature, about how you want to, these projects that are on the drawing board are being considered and how they're going to help the European Union. There are tons of them. Having a few examples is probably not a bad idea. Some are better than others, though. One that I've seen a lot of people talking about in some of the discussions on this topic is the idea of access to 5G networks. The idea being that China is investing heavily in the development of 5G networks and is very likely to include them, or will be including them, in its development and rollout of sort of the digital aspect of the Belt and Road. I am not crazy about this argument, to be honest with you, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a major security concern, and it's very easy to turn for negatives that are going to be looking at security. The company that has overwhelmingly developed Chinese 5G is Huawei. You've probably heard about Donald Trump and the United States issues with them. They are heavily suspected, with some credible evidence, of working with Chinese spy agencies, as well as these sort of crooked governments in countries like in Africa who are spying on their opponents. So the idea of allowing them to come in and sort of be the developer developer or be involved in the development of 5G networks throughout Europe would be something that I think would be very easily turned by the con as a security risk. You would sort of argue that it's kind of a Trojan horse. We're going to give you this great 5G network and pay no attention to that weird clicking in the background or whatever, right? No, we're not spying on you. So I'm a little bit hesitant about that. Also, I would say there's an argument that it's non-unique. There's actually some evidence that EU nations are pushing forward pretty well on 5G networks in the status quo. They're actually doing a better job than the United States. It's still likely, I think, that if you were to have Chinese investment from Belt and Road, that it would go faster. But how much faster? Like in a round with these really short speeches, are you really going to be able to explain to the judge that like a difference of, say, 18 months in developing 5G is going to be a huge deal? And are you going to be able to show that it would be 18 months? So the difference for the pro on this is kind of marginal and the risks are high. So I'm not crazy about the 5G argument. The other thing would be, and I think a better one potentially would be investment in energy generally and specifically green energy. So we have this Brookings Institution article from 2018 that talks about how the Belt and Road is going to be critical for moving energy consumption beyond fossil fuels. China is issuing $25 billion worth of green bonds for infrastructure projects. Basically, this new sort of green Belt and Road initiative is a major part of the way that they're approaching it from now on. And so, first of all, investing in energy infrastructure is its own benefit within Europe. Second, this is a really good turn on what is likely to be a con argument about climate change and about sort of the general adversity that China has and the carbon emissions that they have. So helping countries develop clean energy and investing billions of dollars in that is probably a good argument. So, those are the basic core economic and infrastructure arguments. Again, on the infrastructure side, you can kind of pick and choose your favorite. But I really think that those are going to be the kind of things that pretty much every pro is looking at. Now, in terms of sort of the defensive side of the pro, I think that the argument is basically the idea that we talked about earlier, which is that joining is like a no commitment kind of deal that just involves sitting down and agreeing to negotiate, and that this is only upside, right? Having the EU sit down and negotiate as a bloc is all upside and no downside. So let's just go through how that argument works, okay? So obviously, what these individual countries are doing to join the Belt and Road is signing these memoranda of understanding, because as we said earlier, there's no formal organization to join, there's no formal way to join it. And we talked about how scholars like Hing Wang talk about how this is deliberate and there's no formal structure to it. But you don't have to take Hing Wang's word for it, you don't have to take my word for it. If you want to know what these MOUs mean, you can actually read them, and what they will tell you is if you look at the MOUs that these countries are signing, they explicitly say that they are not legally binding, right? They tell you in the very end, you can look, for example, at this example of MOU between China and Latvia. It just tells you right there in the final section that it is not legally binding. It's just a statement that we're going to try to work together if we can. By the way, primary sources are good. If you can manage to pull up the actual agreement and have it and cite it, that's a good thing, as you don't have to go through sort of an intermediary and question whether they know what they're doing. So basically the idea, defensively for the pro is that, look, all we do is we sign this MOU. It says we're going to try to work with China. We're going to try to reach deals on these infrastructure projects. If we find deals we like and they work, then we'll go with them, and that'll be a net benefit. And if we don't, we'll just walk away or tell them to try something else, right? Zero downside, all upside. That's the basic idea that the pro is running. But in addition to that, there's a more definite upside for the pro, which is the idea that the European Union negotiating as a bloc, as a collective organization, is going to have a lot more leverage than individual countries negotiating on their own, right? So Germany's economy minister, Peter Altmaier, said in April 2019 that he basically thinks that there is a general agreement among the major powers in the EU, Germany, France, and others, that the right course is to deal with China as a bloc. In other words, we will only sign your MOU or whatever this document ends up being if we sign it as a bloc, right? Now, of course, half the EU has already done that, but their position, some of these major powers, these major economies think that they should get together and sign a collective MOU, and that will give them better leverage to negotiate better terms. And you could use this to do potentially a lot of things. You could use it to get better rates on financing, more control over the construction, better environmental issues, things like that. And so, first of all, this idea, there are some sources that will drop the notes, but it's basically just common sense. When a bunch of parties get together and negotiate together, they have more leverage. We talked about this on the pharmaceutical topic earlier when we said that one reason the government might want to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies is because it's basically negotiating on behalf of like all of the people in the country. If one person negotiates with a pharmaceutical company, they can just sort of say, forget it, we don't have to deal with you, you either take it or leave it. But when you're talking about potentially purchasing millions and millions of pharmaceutical products, well, then the company's going to have to make you a better deal. Same thing with labor unions. Workers get together and they negotiate together so they have more leverage over their employer. And the same thing would be true here. If these countries sit down and negotiate with China, they're going to have a lot more leverage to control what China does. And in fact, one of the criticisms of Belt and Road is the idea that China is currently using a strategy of trying to pick off these countries one by one, as you see here, to sort of play off their hardships and rivalries and resentment, and sort of give individual countries like Italy the sort of prize of being the first to do it, and instead of having to actually negotiate really good terms with a single entity, right? And this sort of goes to the basic idea that Belt and Road is inevitable, right? And this is, I think, an idea that Pro is going to run a really hammer on, which is Belt and Road's happening. 68 countries are members. Half the EU has already signed an MOU. Billions and trillions of dollars have already been spent. It's going to happen. The only question is, are we as the European Union going to sit down as adults, as a group together and negotiate, or are we going to hide our head in the sand and let our members get picked off one by one by one, right? So, and this is interesting in the sense that it's not only offensive in the sense that it says we benefit, right, by doing this. It's also defensive, right? What you do is you say as the pro, for any harm that the con comes in and says about what China's doing, your response is, whatever the harm is, we as the EU are in a better position to fight back against it and to negotiate against it when we speak with a united voice, right? When we sit down at the bargaining table together, whatever it is, whether it's environmental standards on these projects, whatever it is, we're in a better position to negotiate on it if we sit down together. And so this is kind of a thematic idea that I think the pro needs to use throughout its entire case, which is Belt and Road is happening. There's no realistic scenario in which we stop it from happening, but the adult decision is to sit down and negotiate and to push back when we disagree, but to be a part of it and to have this discussion collectively. So those are the sort of basic offensive and defensive points, one of them being economics and infrastructure, the other being there's really no reason not to do it. Like there's negotiating is better, negotiating as a block is good. There are some second tier arguments that I want to talk about quickly. Some are better than others. I'll tell you that none of them are really super impressive to me. I wish we could find some more esoteric stuff on the pro, but I just don't think it worked as well as some people say. So for example, one argument that people talk about is promoting European unity. This is an argument that people have talked about in other topic analyses that I've seen, but it really depends, I think, on a kind of a questionable interpretation of the resolution, right? So the basic argument is, right now there's division within the EU, right? Some countries have joined. Many of the more powerful economic countries are saying they don't like the idea, criticizing the Belt and Road. And the idea is, if European Union were to join as a bloc, that would seem to signal, right, that they had put their disagreements aside and that they had agreed to work together, right? But this misunderstands the role of a ballot in debate, right? The judge can only vote to make the resolution happen. They cannot make the likely real world causes happen. They cannot make, for example, these countries agree with each other if they don't. And I'll give you an analogy. A few years back, I was watching the NSTA finals in LD, and one debater was basically saying that if we allow, I guess, something like open borders, well, a world in which open borders were allowed would probably be one where people had kind of gotten over racism to a large extent. And so therefore, to vote for open borders is to vote against racism. And the answer is, no, that's not true. Voting for open borders is just voting for open borders. I mean, you as the judge do not have the ability to sort of fiat the real world circumstances that might give rise to this. Your ballot is what's giving rise to it here. You're voting to have it happen, and it's happening, right? So I just don't think this idea that if we vote to join BRI, that these divisions go away. If Germany and France don't like BRI and you cast your ballot for the pro, then what happens is the European Union joins BRI over the objections of France and Germany. Like, they're all dragged in as a union, but the people who objected and the countries that objected, they still object. You don't have the ability to force them to not object. That's not part of the resolution, right? And so what you do is you end up sort of turning this argument on its head, and you see that, like, they join, France and Germany, which are 40% of the GDP of the European Union, get dragged in against their wishes, right? And this further fractures the European Union and has even greater danger of sort of blowing it up and basically dissolving the union entirely. So I don't think there's any way that sort of forcing it in eliminates the disagreements. Like I said earlier, voting in a debate round to ban assault weapons doesn't change people's opinions about assault weapons. They're still what they are. So another argument is that the EU is kind of going to be the deciding factor in whether Belt and Road is completed in its entirety. right? And this basically goes to the idea that the Belt and Road is a network and it has what we would call positive network externalities. And that's just basically the idea that when you have something that's supposed to link up other stuff, it really only gets truly useful when you have the whole thing done, right? So, for example, a road that's supposed to connect two towns, right? Town A and Town B. Well, if the road goes 80% of the way up to Town B, it has no value because you can't use it to move between them, right? When you connect it all the way, it has 100% of its value. It has a network externality. Now, to be clear, Belt and Road is a little bit different because obviously it connects more than one point. So it's already connected some places and it certainly has value, but the idea it'll have a lot more value once it's completely done all over the Eurasian continent. And there's plenty of evidence that China can't do this alone. Like China and its Chinese state-owned enterprises cannot finance Belt and Road alone. There's a Bruegel May 2017 estimate saying it's going to cost up to $1.7 trillion a year, that China can't pay for that due to an economic slowdown, and basically that the EU would be in a uniquely good position to get involved, to finance it, and then have leverage over it, right? To basically kind of become a co-equal partner in it. This is not a bad argument, especially if you're running a pro that looks to the benefits of the entire world, because it talks about how the whole circuit, the whole loop of Belt and Road will become much more valuable when we finish it, and China can't finish it on its own. So we, the European Union, are kind of the deciding factor. I don't love it, but I don't hate it. I think it's not a bad idea. Another argument, I think maybe the last big one, is the idea of shifting the balance of power away from sort of a unipolar world that focuses on the United States and to a multipolar world that sort of focuses more on three major powers like the United States, Europe, and China. This is the idea that Europe has been dependent for too long on the United States as a major ally. It's become too beholden to Washington on issues of peace and security and trade, especially under an administration like Trump, which is highly controversial, which is more isolationist, which is often throwing our allies under the bus. This does have some intuitive appeal right now, but remember that the debate, doesn't end, right now or even in the next 4 years if Trump were reelected, right? So this is why, for example, this dependence would be why our European allies have been willing to jump on board of our crazy military misadventures in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the idea is you want to get away from that. So what you want to do is not abandon the United States, but you want to cultivate other options. You want to develop other trading partners and other diplomatic partners and kind of have multiple options so that you don't always have to do what the United States says. And so on the blog Zero Hedge from April 2019, and by the way, if you cite this, do not cite the author as Tyler Durden. Tyler Durden is the main character from Fight Club. This is a pseudonym, so don't cite him as Tyler Durden. Just cite it as Zero Hedge. But they basically say that, the thing that unites European politicians is they want to be able to say to Washington, you can't have this sort of suffocating dominance over us. We want to have multiple partners that we can look to. I don't think this is terrible, except that you're going to have to justify the idea of having a closer relationship with a country that has, major human rights issues, that has whole cities turned into prison camps for Muslims, that has major issues in terms of the South China Sea and ignoring international law. As bad as the United States is, I do think we have to have a reality check. There's no equivalency. And by the way, I'm not some, fan of the current administration in the United States, but there's absolutely no equivalency in the real world between China with its constant monitoring, its prison camps, its human rights abuses, its state-controlled media, its censorship. There's no comparison between them and what, for example, even the Trump administration is doing today. So, I would be very careful in any sort of political argument where we want to make an ally out of China and sort of treat them as equivalent to the United States. You don't have to love the current regime in the United States or the things that we've done over the years to realize that China, on balance, is a lot worse model, at least in the minds of most American judges who you're going to be speaking to, than the United States would be. So I don't know that this is great. So I'm really kind of focusing on economics, focusing on sort of standard infrastructure projects, and really heavily focusing on the idea that there's no downside and that the upside is that whatever bad things you don't like, we're in a better position to negotiate. So that for me is the basics on the pro, and now we will turn and look at the basics on the con. So on the con, you have a lot more options, I think, than you do on the pro for where exactly you're going to choose to fight on this. And it kind of goes in sort of tiers from the very high level stuff like China is a fundamentally bad actor. It's illiberal in the small L sense. It's undemocratic. It's dangerous. It doesn't respect international law. And we just need to oppose China's growing power in the world. We don't need them to be a superpower. Belt and Road is key for them to be a superpower, and we should just fight. This is sort of the highest level, most fundamental fight you can have. And then it sort of goes down in tiers from there. So, for example, you could say, well, maybe China's not inherently bad, but there are fundamental problems with the Belt and Road itself. That would be where we talk about the Belt and Road exacerbating, for example, climate change, problems with the debt it creates, and things like that. And then you could go further down than that and say, okay, maybe Belt and Road is not fundamentally flawed, but it is not necessary and it's potentially harmful for the EU. So there may be countries that need the Belt and Road who are, less affluent countries with fewer options for financing, but we as the European Union don't. We should be looking elsewhere. Then you get to arguments, for example, about how the EU may not even be able to join, or if they did join, it would be meaningless, or it might be better for individual countries to make these calls. And then lastly, kind of at the bottom, you have arguments about how, maybe this will be a good idea at some point, but China's talking about making changes in how they approach the Belt and Road, so we should wait and see. We should not vote pro now. We should wait and see what they do, how they change the Belt and Road, and see if it's more favorable to us, and then we can make a decision. So all these different tiers, and within them you have different permutations in each tier. For example, human rights, geopolitical influence, media influence, climate change, debt traps, things like that. There's no way we can cover all of them. There's just no way we can do all of them in an hour, 15-minute video. But what we can do is kind of give you a survey and talk a little bit about like what you're going to need to do in order to try to be effective at each one of these different levels and how you sort of pick one. I will say, I'm always a big fan on the con of having multiple independent routes to victory. So I really do, as I sort of look at these lists, I really do like a case that sort of says 2 or 3 different things and basically says, we're going to give you 3 alternatives about why Belt and Road is bad, and if you agree with even one of them, right, you should vote no. So for example, you start with China's bad, we should oppose them, right? If you agree with that, fine. Number 2, even if China's good, Belt and Road is going to blow up climate change. It's going to make it worse. If you vote for that, vote for us on. If you don't agree, then vote for that. And lastly, even if you don't think it will do climate change, the European Union does not have the ability to do this. It would fundamentally alter the structure of the European Union. The individual states should do it, right? I'm just giving those as 3 examples. Each one of those 3 operates independently. It gives the pro a lot more that they have to cover, and basically it lets you sort of check down whichever one they're not covering effectively later on in the round. You can come in and start piling on more supporting evidence as long as it's part of an argument you've previously made, and they basically have to pick their poison if you write it well. So I'm a big fan of like not dumping everything into one thing like geopolitics or climate change. Give them 3 different things to hit, and then just wait and see which one they don't hit effectively, and just push all in on that. This is a common strategy in policy debate, and as long as you speak at a normal rate and you talk like a normal person, which is part of PF, you can absolutely do it in public forum. As long as you don't, turn it into mini high-speed policy debate. Anyway, what I want to do is start at the sort of the top of the tier and talk about the major macro argument about basically why China is bad for the world, bad as a geopolitical power, and why Belt and Road is key and we shouldn't support that. So there's sort of 2 parts to this argument, right? The first is that Chinese influence is bad, right? And there are endless articles about why China is a rogue actor. It's a dangerous power. We don't want them to become sort of a bipolar, a multipolar world where they have a lot of influence. No way we could read all of those, but like one example just comes from Ben Zawacki of the Asia Times in August 2019, and he talks about China's a single-party state. It's not a democracy. The democracy is a lie. It's a sham. It has the most pervasive facial recognition system in the world. It has a firewall designed to obstruct subversive ideas and information. It even uses its policies about censorship to affect American and Western countries like Google when they try to operate over there. It has a social credit score system by which it monitors things that you buy online, things you say on social media, whether you pay your bills on time, and it uses to like blackball citizens. Like if they aren't ready to quite put you in jail, they will basically deny your ability to buy plane tickets or train tickets or any number of other things. It's a really frightening idea. They have put 1 million Muslims, Uyghur Muslims, in re-education camps, turning whole cities into prison camps for these folks. They have turned Tibet into a totalitarian police state. They have relentlessly persecuted religious minorities like the Falun Gong, and many other things, like, for example, ignoring international law in staking out territory in the South China Sea. So basically the argument is you just sort of have to push all in and say China's a bad actor. And you have to be willing to say, we know the United States isn't perfect. We know Europe's not perfect. We've all done bad things. But China is fundamentally different. They don't respect the basic tenets of individual dignity, diversity, differences of religion and things like that. They are a totalitarian surveillance state, and we simply don't want them having more influence. If you're not comfortable sort of drawing that distinction and saying they're worse than the United States, if you're in a part of the country where you think judges might be put off by that, you have to gauge that. But that is something you have to do if you want to make this macro level argument, is to just say there is no moral equivalency here. The United States is far from perfect, but China is far worse, and let us explain why. That's what you have to do if you want to run it on this level, right? If you want to run this level of an argument. And then once you do that, you have many, many different options about how Belt and Road is key to China expanding its influence. So, for example, there's just sort of a generic article about how Belt and Road is designed to project political influence around the world. This is Thomas Cavanagh from the Texas National Security Review in 2019. By the way, this is a very good article. Go ahead and read the whole thing. But it just talks about how the Belt and Road is designed to project influence around the world. It improves bilateral leverage by basically giving China leverage over its debtor countries, people that owe it money. It owns, in some cases, infrastructure within the country. It has a lot of trade with the country. Just things we've talked about before, right? It's a good source on those. It talks about how this already works, about how it's already using its influence in places in Africa and Latin America to make them sort of do their bidding, how it's sort of blackballing Taiwan, and Taiwan is losing a lot of its diplomatic partners. In other words, how this influence is working. And then lastly, it talks about how, as sort of an added bonus for China, when you build all these structures around the world, in some cases it's building this sort of string of pearls naval bases, right? But in addition to that, just the bare fact that you send out you have to send, Chinese, in some cases, Chinese military and security forces to these places to secure them. It gives you kind of an excuse to just start distributing your military all around the world. So it's a good article about how the whole thing is just sort of designed as a sort of long-term Trojan horse to kind of send out Chinese influence into the world, hard power and soft power. The Econ View from May 2017 is more specific. It talks about how Europeans are worried that BRI is designed to make smaller European states become dependent on China, and how once they're dependent, they will not be able to criticize China. So that's a more specific one. Washington Examiner of August 2018. This is another really good article. It's not like a scholarly article. It's kind of a populist kind of approach, but it talks about how the internet aspect of Belt and Road, the digital Belt and Road, is designed to, over the long term, export China's, sort of repressive ideas of how the internet ought to work. And it talks about how they're already doing this in places like Tanzania, how the influence they have there has allowed them to guide Tanzania to like putting in place very repressive internet policies, and how it will be very easy if you are a debtor to Taiwan and you've got their 5G networks getting installed, for them to sort of say, yeah, you might want to think about, censoring a few things that are kind of nasty that they say about us as Chinese, as the Chinese regime, right? Beyond that, there's this Brookings Institution in April 2019 talking about how the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker says that basically already one of their members that has signed up for Belt and Road is basically unable to condemn Chinese human rights policy. So you can say this is not speculative. It's already happening in the countries that are signing on to this. They're having to censor themselves and mute themselves and criticizing the gross human rights abuses of the Chinese regime. And then the Zawacki article from 2019 also talks about how BRI is part of a larger effort to import Chinese political and social influence. So in addition to the leverage that you get from having, for example, debt that people owe you, and from having, potentially the internet, he talks about how just the long-term physical presence of Chinese nationals in these countries, diplomats, nationals, people who are doing the construction, in some cases military folks, has the effect of sort of softening the country up to the idea of Chinese influence just over the long term, and how it's part of a larger campaign of things like, for example, the so-called Confucius Institute, which is a sort of front organization that China sets up in educational environments around the world, like with universities, to try to give a whitewashed version of their history. Anyway, the bottom line is there's many different ways you can talk about how Belt and Road is a key part of expanding Chinese influence and how Chinese influence is bad, and we should just draw a line in the sand and fight it. If you do it, you have to say, number one, China's fundamental values are not compatible over the long term with liberal democracy. They're not as good as liberal democracy. We should prefer liberal democracy. That it is China's clear strategy to expand their economic influence gradually over the long term. China has talked for a long time about how they have a 100-year strategy. They take things slow. They do not try to win over influence by going and taking over countries or making quick moves. They're going to wait you out. They're going to gradually wear you away like the water washing against the rock. This is part of their goal. Belt and Road is a huge part of their goal. And then lastly, the ultimate goal is to amass so much leverage, so much soft power that basically it's very difficult or impossible to criticize them, at which point they can do all kinds of nasty things both in China and outside of China, and there's not much that countries can do to stop them. So that is the core of the basic argument of the sort of China bad, or Chinese politics and influence, at least globally, is bad, and we should just stand against that. Now, a really important issue, I think, is going to be the idea that the Khan can point to alternatives to Belt and Road. These are not counter plans, as we're going to see in a minute. It's more about sort of just looking at the status quo and understanding that there are things that the European can do and is doing that are not joining, but they have all the same positive effects of joining with none of the downside. I think this is a really powerful, simplifying argument that the Khan can use. It takes a minute to set up, but I do think it can be powerful. So the basic argument is that the EU's proper role is not to join Belt and Road. If EU members want to join, fine, but the EU's role should be to formulate its own infrastructure plans that put Europe, not China, first, and then to advocate for those plans in negotiations with China. And surprise, surprise, the EU is already doing this with what's called its own plan for EU-Asia connectivity, which is called the EU-China Connectivity Platform. I have it abbreviated EU-CCP. But it's the EU-China Connectivity Platform. And under this framework, the EU has already held multiple meetings with China, the most recently in July 2018. The EU-CCP has its own list of over 30 different infrastructure projects, mainly within the EU, but some actually in China. So this plan, the Chinese Connectivity Project from the EU, is actually looking at doing the inverse of what BRI does and actually even reaching into China and helping them build infrastructure over there. And the whole idea is to interlink infrastructure projects undertaken as part of what's called the Trans-European Transport Network, or TEN-T, within the EU. So basically, the European Union has its own sort of articulated plan similar to Belt and Road that puts Europe first. And what the European Union ought to be doing is not joining, right, but rather advocating for its plan and working with China as they advocate their plan. But this is not just my idea. This is not something I made up. So there's this policy brief from this group called Klingendale, which is a Dutch policy institute, called Engaging but Not Endorsing China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it's recent. It comes from May 2019. And what it basically says is, so the real question is, can governments and other stakeholders engage with China's BRI without endorsing it in full? And what they say is, yes, you absolutely can. And you can look to the model of what Japan has done. Japan has basically entered into an agreement to work with China on infrastructure generally, but has refused to specifically endorse Belt and Road, instead saying, look, China, we've got our own plans, you've got your plans, we can sit down together and try to reconcile them, but we're not going to join your plan and you don't have to join our plan, right? And so just to read what the report from Klingendale says, what stands out is that Japan's conditional engagement with China has resulted in an MOU on business cooperation in third countries that mentions neither the BRI nor Japan's preferred free and open Indo-Pacific plan. European governments that do want to cooperate with China on infrastructural connectivity should do the same by making the signing of an MOU conditional on reference not just to China's BRI, but also to Europe's Euro-Asia connectivity strategy. In other words, the basic idea is we can sit down, we can negotiate, we can agree. That's really the only thing that the European Union can do, right? But what you say to China is, look, China, you may be able to go to Sri Lanka or Ecuador and put this take it or leave it BRI deal on the table, this prepackaged deal, and they'll have to take it because they're small. But we're not, freaking Sri Lanka. We're not Ecuador. We're the EU. We're as big an economy as you are. You need us as much as we need you, right? So like Japan, here's what we're willing to do. We will sit down and sign an MOU with you, and it will be about infrastructure cooperation, and it will we will say that we will work together to try to figure out strategies on infrastructure cooperation, but it will not commit us to joining your BRI, and it will not make you join our connectivity platform. What we will do instead is we will sit down and respect each other as equals, right? We will respect that the other side has a plan and they have an agenda, and we will try to work together to have both agendas kind of synergize and work together when we can. But what we will not do, China, is you will not come here and tell us we have to bend the knee, right, and join your plan, and we will not tell you that you have to bend the knee, politically speaking, and join our plan. We will treat each other as equals. And guess what? Not only is this a good idea, but it's something that's already happening in the real world. At the at the European Union China Connectivity Platform 2018 meeting, right, there was a written agreement that specifically said that the EU and China would try to strengthen synergies between the 10T and the BRI. Neither side said we're joining. Neither side said we're going to use this as our framework. They both said, look, we have these two different plans. We're going to sit down and we're going to try to find ways to cooperate, right? This is not a counter plan because we're not asking the judge really to fiat anything. It's already happening in the status quo. It's just a common sense solution rooted in the idea that these things are already happening. Now, the unique advantages of doing it this way rather than joining is you get all the same benefits. The pros saying, well, what's the downside of sitting down and negotiating? The con says, okay, fine, we agree. The only question then is whether or not we join. So the unique advantage is saying, look, we get all the same benefits of the EU joining, which basically means sitting down and negotiating, right? But without, number one, without handing China a major political victory in terms of the perception of us, bowing to them and accepting their plan. And number two, very importantly, without forcing any EU countries that don't want to join into joining, because all we'd be saying is, look, we will try to reconcile these two ideas. We have our plan, you have yours, we'll try to reconcile them. This argument leverages the vagueness of what the term join means, and it really just says, look, Judge, this isn't really a debate about whether we should work together on infrastructure. We are working together on infrastructure. We have these connectivity platform meetings, and we're going to continue to work together on infrastructure. It would be crazy not to. All this debate is really about is whether one side should force the other side to bend the knee, to bow, and to join their program, right? And the argument is we say we shouldn't. We've got ours, they've got theirs. Let's come up with a memorandum of understanding that recognizes that we are co-equal sovereign entities, right? We will sit down and negotiate, but neither side has to join the other sides. You get all the benefits with none of the downsides of forcing institutions like France and Germany into it and without handing China this major coup in terms of global perception. This seems to me to be a simple, it's a resolution that is super complicated in terms of the logistics of what's going on because of the vagueness. This is a way, if you can pull it off, to sort of say, it's not even about infrastructure. We're going to do infrastructure. That's going to happen. It's not about climate change. We're going to do climate change. It's about whether we force somebody to join your club, join my club. No, let's just treat each other as equals. It's a semantic argument, but it's a potentially powerful semantic argument. I wish we weren't having debates on things like this, but when we choose resolutions from NSDA that use vague terms like join and super complicated international law issues, we almost can't help it. Maybe this is the lawyer in me coming out, but that's just how I feel. The next argument that I think you're going to see a lot is going to be climate change for the con. Basically, the idea is there's sort of two separate mechanisms here. The first one is that Belt and Road itself, like the projects themselves, are going to expand the CO2 emissions in the countries where they're happening. And then the second is that Belt and Road is going to expand domestic consumption in China and create sort of pipelines for fossil fuels that are going to increase China's consumption and its production of CO2. This is clearly going to be an area where the pro is going to push back directly. As we said earlier, there are cards and there's evidence out there that the Green Belt and Road Initiative, right? This new sort of transformation of Belt and Road that China's talking about is investing, for example, in renewable energy. So definitely the pro is going to try to push back and kind of turn your impacts and say, no, it's actually going to make climate change better. So you do have to be ready to have sort of a multi-layered kind of fight on that if you choose to go down the climate change route. But Isabel Hilton, writing for Yale 360 in January 2019, sort of basically lays out the argument that China has a model of development that goes really fast, it's really big, it has very few concerns for emissions, and if we start exporting this around the world to other countries, there's really going to be no hope for meeting Paris Agreement goals for averting catastrophic climate change. So, what she says is BRI has the potential to transform economies in China's partner countries, yet it could also tip the world into catastrophic climate change. The idea is that you've got 70 countries that all have, economies that are, in the neighborhood. They're much smaller than China, but when you put them together and you sort of start exporting China's methods of construction and their sort of general priorities on the environment, it starts to multiply the negative impact that China's already having with its massive CO2 emissions. Now, absolutely, pros are going to come back and say, well, China's getting better in this area and they promised the Green New Deal. But what you have to do is you actually have to look at what China's doing, not what they're saying. That's always very important because, unfortunately, China is very adept at propaganda, and you have to be, sort of watch where they do, not what they say, right? So if you actually watch what they do, according to Hilton, Chinese companies are involved in at least 240 coal projects in 25 of the Belt and Road countries, and we see that basically a huge percentage of the new development of coal is going on in these countries. And so the idea is, don't, and they're not all, for example, clean coal plants. In fact, most of them aren't. So don't just look at what they're claiming, look at what they're doing. What they're doing is going out around the world and building a whole bunch more coal plants than would be built otherwise, and that's dangerous and that's bad. Right? The next thing is that China doesn't have, well, first of all, China is making promises that they're going to sort of pivot to this new green belt and road, and they're going to focus more on CO2 emissions. But as the Columbia University summary of BRI environmental protections points out, there are no actual mechanisms to do that. Like, there is no agency overseeing BRI projects that has actually put in place emissions standards for these projects. They have no rules about like what the emissions have to be, about how they have to be limited. So basically everything that they've done so far, talking about greening the Belt and Road, is just pure rhetoric. It's just pure propaganda. And so if your opponent says anything about sort of the green, they'll probably read cards that say things like, well, the green Belt and Road has the potential to do this, that has the potential to do that, it can do this, it can do that, because it hasn't been implemented yet. Your response is, don't look at what they say they're going to do, look at what they're doing. There is, according to Columbia, there is absolutely no mechanism in place to implement any CO2 emission standards, any environmental standards, and that's the basic idea. They're just not doing these things. So until they do that, until they have an enforcement mechanism, there is, again, it's puffery, right? They're just blowing smoke. It doesn't mean anything. And then lastly, those are sort of the impacts from the other countries sort of importing Chinese development through Belt and Road. But a 2018 EU Parliament report actually argues that Belt and Road is a mechanism for increasing China's own emissions. So the pro is going to point out that China has done better and is doing a better job of reducing its emissions in the last couple of years, but that's not the question. The question is, will growth and a more robust Belt and Road make it better or worse? And the argument that the EU Parliament report has is that one of the goals behind Belt and Road is to begin to build more corridors to import oil and gas into China from Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Pakistan, and potentially other places. So the more the Belt and Road grows, the more robust it gets, the better able China will be to import things like oil and gas and coal into China and use those. So again, China may have improved in this area, but if Belt and Road is going to be used to import more fossil fuels, it's hard to see how that's going to do anything but make China's emissions worse. Not clear that you necessarily have to reach all the way to Europe to do that, but just as a general principle, Belt and Road is feeding China's appetite for fossil fuels. So I do think that the con has the better of this argument, but just be aware that the pro does have some decent pushback, and that you probably are going to have to get into a fight, throughout the summary speeches and maybe even into the final focus if you really want to carry the day on climate change. But obviously the impacts that you can use in terms of long-term impact of climate change are really big if you can make it there. So it is probably a strategy that's worth considering. Okay, and so lastly, let's talk about what I guess you'd call maybe some of the second-tier con arguments, things that I have heard mentioned that you might or might not want to include as part of your case. Some are stronger than others, but I did want to try to touch on them as quickly as I could, given just the sheer amount of stuff out there, just to give them a few minutes of attention. The first is the argument that joining BRI is going to hurt EU-US relations. Certainly you can make a good faith argument on this. There are certainly impact scenarios that you could get to where bad things happen. I think that most of the impact scenarios on this rely on the sort of very tenuous links to, for example, war or trade wars or things like that are hard to establish with real credible evidence in the brevity of a public forum round. They're more like policy arguments, but you can try to run with them. The real problem with this, though, is that if you know enough about the resolution, you realize the European Union has been dealing with China on infrastructure for a long time. Like we talked about earlier, they're already having these summits, right, on the connectivity platform where they're agreeing to work together on infrastructure. They've already got a huge volume of trade with each other. So you'd really have to have some very persuasive evidence that says the joining, like the precise act of joining, whatever that means, and we don't even really know what it means. You'd have to have some very precise evidence that says that's the brink, right? That's the straw that was going to break the camel's back in terms of U.S. relations. And I just don't see it. I mean, you've already got a ton of this negotiation going on. You got half the members of the EU almost who've already signed MOUs for Belt and Road. So we're either there or we're not. Why is the EU doing a particular thing like joining going to be the thing that really makes the difference? I don't see it. And the other thing is just intuitively, it's not all that clear that the impacts here are super strong for the EU because relations with the United States under the Trump administration are not great right now. You're starting to see more of a rivalry develop in the status quo. So I just don't know that this is the strongest argument, but it is out there and you do need to prepare for it. The second one you hear a lot about is the idea of a debt trap. In other words, China comes in, provides financing for these projects in these low income or lower wealth countries, and basically they can't afford to pay it off, so they end up in situations where they are in what's called a debt trap. They owe money to China forever. Some articles have likened China to sort of a loan shark that comes in and sort of preys upon the weak, and then will come in when you can't pay and sort of take over the infrastructure they built or demand some exorbitant thing like you've got to give us 80% of your oil that you produce. This is a potential argument. The problem is, number one, the EU is not going to be like Sri Lanka, like we said earlier. They're going to be in a position to negotiate for much better terms on this financing. And number two, they're going to be in a position probably to pay them off. The other thing is that empirically, China loses almost as often as it wins on these situations where it lends to people who can't pay. In many cases, you find them sort of having to forgive debts or having to renegotiate the terms on these things. So they end up being sort of like the creditor that gets stiffed by their debtor just as often as not. So it's just not really obvious that this has a real measurable impact that's going to be bad for the EU. A couple of slightly better arguments, I think, is there are cards out there that talk about how BRI is inherently structured to facilitate graft and corruption. For example, this from foreignpolicy.com in 2018, or Foreign Policy Magazine, talks about how, on most of these projects, there's no oversight. The money's coming from China, not from a reputable lender or a reputable financial institution. There's very little accountability, and it's almost kind of built in to be that way. Like, again, it's sort of like a loan shark, right? Rather than borrowing money from a reputable bank that's only going to lend to you if you've got good plans, you're borrowing from somebody who'll, lend it to anybody, and there's a lot of corruption going on. I do think you can find cards and things that say that there is a tendency toward corruption. It could lead to less accountability. Again, not sure how strong those impacts are, but I do think those are out there if that's what you want to look for. And the last two I want to talk about is how maybe now is not the time to join Belt and Road because maybe things aren't looking so good. So one contention could be that Belt and Road is actually not in good financial shape right now, and it might not be the time to join. And this is from Schrader 2018. The idea is that what it talks about is how state-owned banks within China itself are withdrawing their support to the extent they can, right, from Belt and Road. It says that BRI lending by major banks in China has dropped by 89% since 2015, and lending by commercial banks has ceased almost entirely. So big portions of the financing infrastructure in China are looking at this and they're wondering if it's sustainable. A lot of these projects fail. A lot of these debts don't get paid back. So even on China's end, remember, they're not just pulling this money directly out of the Chinese treasury. In most cases, they're using Chinese state-owned enterprises. And to the extent they have autonomy, and they do have a little bit, they're pulling out of it. And so if they think it's a bad deal, right, and they're basically tied to the Chinese government, then that should give you a lot of pause about whether this is a sustainable deal in the long term. And then the last thing you can sort of say is a very simple argument, which is China is now already sort of talking since April of 2019 about the need for reform of Belt and Road. Xi Jinping got up at the Belt and Road Summit, I believe, or got up in April 2019 at any rate, and talked about how he understood there needed to be reforms of Belt and Road and how China basically needed to be a better global citizen on other things, for example, like intellectual property and currency manipulation. And this was partly because of the pushback by members of the international community on Belt and Road and on other things. It was at the Belt and Road Forum, right? And so basically the argument would be, well, look, China is right now in the process of sort of thinking what concessions it needs to make to us to persuade us, not just the European Union, but the EU is a big part of it. They're trying to think, well, maybe we need to give these folks a better deal, not just on Belt and Road with things like allowing third-party investment. That's one thing they've been talking about, but on currency manipulation, on intellectual property, major economic issues that are out there. Well, if they are deliberating about that and sort of about to come back with a better offer to us and to say, here are the changes we'll make, the last thing you want to do is rush in and go, oh, no, don't worry about it. We accept your offer. We think Belt and Road is great, right? To the extent that they are worried that major major international groups and institutions and countries might say no, let them come back and make another offer first. In other words, this is not the time to join Belt and Road. We should wait for China to advance whatever reforms they're going to do to Belt and Road, to currency manipulation, to intellectual property. And once they do that, once we see what they've done, then maybe we can join Belt and Road. But right now, we want to keep the pressure on them and use our leverage, make them come back to us with a better offer, because they basically told us that they're looking at how to do that. So now is not the time to join. So those are some sort of second tier arguments I think that you might see. Again, the con has got a lot of options. We didn't really have time to cover them in a lot of depth here, although I do think we took a good look at some more sort of strategic options about how to position yourself on it. And hopefully that was helpful. So without further ado, we will wrap things up in just a second. So to wrap things up, 3 quick points. First, to anyone at NSDA who's watching this video, please consider, at least in public forum, going forward, maybe being a little bit less enthusiastic about resolutions that deal with international law. As a lawyer, I will just say it is notoriously vague stuff. It is very difficult to sort of do even over a long period of time. Asking these kids to take in something as complex as this and to package it in 45 minutes is just really, really tough to do. We did this last year on Law of the Sea. This is even more sort of out there. You know, remember what public forum was about when we started it a couple of decades ago. Maybe think back to that. We can do policy issues that do not involve just these massive, sprawling, endless subjects. But anyway, we have what we have. So the other 2 things are for people who are actually debating. The first one is something we say very frequently on this channel, which is that you have to be able to tell a story that goes beyond just the cards that you're reading. Whatever avenue you pick on either side of the resolution, whether we're going to fight over what the word join means, if we're going to say there's no downside, or we're going to go on the con and say that, you know, there's an alternative to joining, which is just we both take our positions and we don't force each other to bend the knee, whatever it is. If we're talking about China's bad, we should oppose them. If we're talking about climate change, be able to tell the story. In other words, when you practice with your partner and when you prepare, yes, you're going to have to spend a lot of time preparing, you know, blocks and things like that, but also put the legal pad down, close the laptop, whatever, and just talk to each other and be able to explain the story. And so, for example, if we're talking about joining, be able to say, look, at the end of the day, Judge, what we're talking about here is we have 2 choices. One is that one side can make the other join its proposal and just insist, or we can just sit down as equals, and here's why this is better. And just say it without anything in front of you. Whatever your angles are, whatever your arguments are, this is such a complex topic. Remember, your judge is going to come in completely green as to what a lot of these terms are. You're going to have to slow down and explain them. So when we're talking, for example, like just from the basics of what Belt and Road is, about what the green Belt and Road is, about what countless other concepts are that we're going to see, you're going to have to be able to slow down and explain it. So be ready to do that, right? The last thing is, this is one that's going to take a lot of work. If you want to be good in debate, you have to put in the work. There are tons of potential blocks out there. My advice on this one is really go pull every Reddit thread you can find, every video like this one, and just, you know, maybe you're not going to use anything in them, but take inventory of what they're saying. You know, the briefs that you buy, you may not use. If you buy briefs, you may not use, you know, what's being said in them, but just take inventory and go ahead and have as many blocks as possible, and just, you know, work hard, put in the work. But then beyond that, you know, try to find that central point that you can defend and bring things back to, like the definition of join, like climate change, like China is a danger, right? That you can come back to as your sort of selling point at the end, right? Because if you get into a debate where it's just everybody's talking in a lot of, you know, we're going and talking about Malaysia and Sri Lanka and Ecuador, it's very, very easy to lose control of the round, and the judge ends up basically having a coin flip. So have a safe space that you can pull your case back to and say, look, at the end of the day, here's the core message, right? So with that, it's going to be an interesting start to the year. Not my favorite resolution, as I said, but I know you guys are going to do amazing because you always do amazing. As always, remember, the notes contain all of the sources we cite. If you've got questions, I know we went fast on this topic. I apologize we had to, but please, if you've got questions about terms we used or things we said, please drop them below, and we will do our best to answer. So we are well and truly into 2019-2020. We will see you in a couple of months, but for now, best of luck. And as always, work hard, have fun, and hail State.